audio is working so you can hear. We are recording this session. Your microphone will be muted during the presentation, so as you have a need, if you have questions that you'd like to pose to Chris, please enter those in the chat box as we move through the presentation. You will also all receive in the next few days a copy of these PowerPoint slides. Look for those. They will give you lots of references as you find some other information that you'd like to pursue that Chris is sharing. So with that, we're going to start. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Chris Crutcher to this webinar. This is the 6th in a series of NEH webinars that we've had. We sponsor them. We have a lot of people from Sigma Tau Delta, Sigma Kappa Delta, and I know we have a lot of students joining us this evening, which is fantastic. Chris and I have somewhat of a history. I introduced him some 30 years ago, actually, when we were both a little younger, and over the course of my career and his writing career, we have intersected through NCTE and other places. Chris was also a keynote speaker for Sigma Tau Delta in the Minneapolis convention some years ago, and we are pleased to say that he's an honorary member of Sigma Tau Delta, as well as a fine writer in many ways. You see that he is an author, obviously young adults as well as adult texts. He was a former child and family specialist and did a lot of work in the Spokane, Washington area. He's the recipient of the 1998 NCTE Intellectual Freedom Award and the 2000 American Library Association Margaret Edwards Award. His email is there. He invites people to send him notes at any time, so feel free to do that. So without further ado, Chris, take it away. Chris, your audio is not on.
How's it now?
There you
go. Okay. if I keep pushing buttons, I finally get it. It's really an honor to be here, and the bulk of what I've written really is young adult. I have some nonfiction adult things and one adult book I wrote back in the 90s. It was kind of a thriller. But all the books, whether adult or young adult, they've all kind of come out of my experience as a teacher in an alternative school and a teenager, and then all the work that I've done with child abuse and neglect, which I spent about 20 years and 32 actually working with the child abuse with the child protection team, which is a voluntary group of people who hear the toughest cases and kind of make recommendations to the social workers. But what kind of happened to me, and I think the thing that got me going was I grew up in a really, really small town in Idaho. It was a logging town. We had like 943 people in town total. My high school on a good day had just under 100 students. My graduating class, I think, was 15. We had 10 boys and 5 girls, which left the boys in serious social retardation well into our 20s and 30s. But what I didn't realize as I was growing up was what a closed system I was growing up in. I mean, I probably didn't see an African American human being in the flesh till I was 11 years old, but I heard the N-word every day. And it takes you a while. You have to separate from what you grow up in to figure out, what you've missed and some of the dangers of your thinking. And I was a high school kid in the 60s and in the early 60s, and a college kid in the late 60s. And I was coming into that time when there was a lot of the same kind of thing that's going on today. It's the Vietnam War was going on. There were all kinds of the whole question about equality and race and all of that stuff was hot. I mean, there's 1968, Tommy Smith and John Carlos were standing atop the Olympic podium with the black fist raised. You know, it's kind of the forerunner probably of what Kaepernick is doing now. And I was behind the curve, but I remember I went to a college that wasn't very diverse. It was very white. And I was a swimmer. That was the one sport that I had any real talent for. And all the winter sports athletes were dressing in the dressing room. And I was in there and I was putting my suit on and getting ready to go to the workout. And the basketball team was on the other side of the lockers. And I heard this kid telling this story. And it was basically a story about how his coach had taken the basketball team into the locker room and locked the door and said, there's a ball player in a town which was about probably 30 miles down the road. He's brand new this year. He's a senior. He's an African American, and he did not call him that. And he said, I want him out of the game before halftime. And as the kid told the story, they got him out of the game before halftime. One of the guys took a shot at him. It looked like they were going to get the ball, knocked him out of bounds. He fell into the bleachers, bruised a kidney, and was out of the game. And he missed 4 or 5 games. And these guys went on and won state. And I'm embarrassed to today that I didn't walk around those guys and tell those guys what jerks I thought they were. But you know, I didn't want to get hurt. 15 years later, when I'm sitting around thinking about wanting to write and looking for a story, that story just kept popping up and popping up and popping up. And I started to realize that I was writing this story out of anger. And one of the reasons, and I didn't really learn this till later because we didn't have the designation in my time, but I was ADHD cubed. And I had that bouncy brain that I just thought I wasn't very smart because it was really hard for me to concentrate. What I didn't know about attention deficit at the time was, yeah, your brain bounces around like crazy when you're bored or when you're not paying attention or when, you know, it doesn't have your attention. But when you do get involved in something, if something feels really intense, you can just get lost in it. And because I had gotten to the place when I wanted to write stories, and I was having a real hard time. I mean, I would sit down to write and my mind would go all over the place, but this particular story just kind of dragged me in. And the question that I had for myself was, what would you have done? I mean, when I was in high school, I'd have done anything to make the football team. And I did. But I didn't have a coach like that. And had I had a coach like that that had thrown me into that kind of a moral dilemma, I thought, I don't know that I would have had the courage to stand up and to make the sacrifice. So that was the story, and I didn't know the guys. They were from a completely different place than I was from, although they were small town guys. And so I just, as a fiction writer, I did realize that, you're a fiction writer, you get to make it up, and you are God of your universe. I mean, you create the characters and you can do what you want with them. But one of the things that I recognized was I had to tell the story in a way that it was believable, because I didn't know there was a designation called young adult fiction in those days. I just thought I was writing a story about a 17-year-old kid. But I knew about that connection had to happen. It had to be realistic. Well, one of the first things that happens for realism with me is the voice, the language. And one of the things, I grew up in a logging town. And I went to college, and then I worked 10 years in an alternative school in Oakland, California, for kids that were being thrown out of school. And then I started working with abuse and neglect. So language didn't even blip my radar. But so that language was there, and I wrote the book, and it came out in 1983, and by late 1984, I opened up somebody told me to, opened up a USA Today, and I was on the top 10 banned books list for that year. I am on a list with Kurt Vonnegut. I'm on a list with Mark Twain. I'm on a list with 9 people everybody knew and 1 nobody knew. And so there was a certain amount of pride in that. But it was a surprising thing to me because because I thought, because I'd grown up, been in high school and college in the '60s, that this book banning thing and the free speech thing, I mean, that was what a lot of that early Berkeley stuff in '63, '64, '65 was really all about. So I was kind of surprised that was still going on. And one of the things about Running Loose was it set the stage, because after that, every book that I've ever written has been banned someplace, and they get challenged quite a bit. And I started looking at what the reasons were. And language was one thing, but it always seemed to me that when I would talk to teachers, or I'd end up at a school board meeting someplace, or I'd be at a conference, the language was there, but that was kind of the easy piece. So much of it was about issues. And then I started to find out that Running Loose was banned in a lot of places because they didn't like the fact that this kid wasn't respectful, that he was jumping up against authority and all of that. So that was part of the book banning thing, but that didn't bother me very much, because this is the United States of America. You can't ban a book. You can take it out of a school someplace, but if you've got a credit card number and an internet connection, you can get any book you want to. So, that wasn't a big deal to me. And for some reason I'm having a hard time. I'm supposed to be able to go through this. There we go. One of the things that I realized that in the censorship battle was the people that I went up against, at least in these discussions about censorship, believed that if you could keep kids from getting certain things in their heads, they'd be safer. And I had come from a really protected environment. My parents were actually pretty progressive, given their time. But one of the things that happened to me when I got out of high school and got out into the world was I felt angry because I hadn't been told the truth about what the world was really about. But the other thing was, I was always getting challenged by either the political or the religious right, and it was about control. It was about and it was done in good faith. I think I can keep my kids safe if they remain innocent. And my problem with that was, if you can tell me when you go from innocence to ignorance, then maybe we can have a discussion about this. But it was always some kind of what was called conservative. Well, my dad was a bomber pilot in World War II. By the time he was the same age I was when I graduated from college, he had flown 35 missions over Germany in a B-17. And he came back to this small town, my mom's town, and he was a patriot. And he was conservative, and he would tell you he was conservative. And if you were running from anything from dog catcher to President of the United States, my old man was your campaign person in Valley County, Idaho. And he would have run a nail through his eye before he'd let a book get banned, because he thought he fought a war for that. And he was a big believer, and my brother and sister and I really felt this, that life was supposed to be uncomfortable. It was. Unexpected things were going to happen. Unexpected things were going to come your way, and your best bet was to be able to handle those things. So that was kind of my take on the banned books, and that was the fight. The fight was about, can we control what goes into kids' heads, or, which I believe we can't, or can we deal with what comes into their heads if we make ourselves safe enough to talk to. And to me, story is a great place to get conversation going. Because number one, if I'm a kid who's suffering from some of the same stuff as the kid in that story is suffering from, I'm probably not going to tell the world about my own condition, but it's a lot easier for me to go ahead and talk about those kids, or to talk about that character. And, I can find out who's on my side and who isn't on my side by how they see a book. I mean, I heard this little girl at one point in a family say, and you can tell who the good teachers are too, because they like the same stories you like. And she was saying the same things about her friends. Well, one of the things that I felt like I wanted to do was try to tell as much truth in my stories as I could tell. Now, that's not big T truth. That's little T truth. And that for me, that's making connection. That's talking about emotional things, humor, tragedy, grief, all those kinds of things that anybody who picks up a book can relate to. So my job at that point, I think, is to tell the best story I can tell. But the reader can't be thinking, this is this old guy writing a book. The reader needs to be connected to your character. So I'm going back and I'm looking at that, and I was looking to that in my own life. And I went back to the only book that I read the whole time I was in high school. I read one book. It was To Kill a Mockingbird. I had a great English teacher, but she was in love with dead white guys, and we wouldn't read a book unless the guy was gone so long that he didn't even speak the same English that we spoke. But she fell in love. I was a sophomore in high school, I think, and it was the year after Mockingbird came out, and we read To Kill a Mockingbird. And I had been copying over my brother's homework and doing all kinds of things to get through book reports. I picked up To Kill a Mockingbird, and I couldn't believe it was a book. And it was like Scout was my friend. And I wasn't just hearing what she had to say, I was inside her head, because first-person narrator, that's what it is. And years later, when I actually sat down and tried to write, and it was years later because I was 35 when I started telling the story, I thought, there's no way in the world that I could have felt the intimacy with Scout if Harper Lee hadn't also felt that intimacy with Scout. She made it available. She made Scout available to me. She sat down and said, I will tell it all. So when I'm sitting there, it's almost as if Scout is saying, I won't tell everyone, but I will tell you. Well, you look on the back of the book and there are 8 jillion copies sold. She's cheating on you. But that connection, that first-person connection, is you and that character. And so that crafting, it stayed with me with it. In Running Loose, first-person narrator, and most of my stuff is first-person narrator. There are a couple that are third, but you're with the main character all the time. And so that voice and that willingness to bear it all is a huge connector, I think, for readers, and at least that was what it was for me. When I came to the place where I wrote Whale Talk, and I talk about Whale Talk a little bit because Whale Talk is probably the book that kids will ask you all the time, what's your favorite book or that you wrote, blah, blah, blah. I don't know that it's my favorite book, but I think if I were to be represented long after I'm gone by one book, Whale Talk would be it. Part of that is because the narrator sounds very, very much like my number 2 stepson, and he has the same kind of mixed race background. And there are characters in the book, and particularly a little girl who was 5 years old when I met her, and I actually had permission to use her story, who was a mixed race kid in a very, very white place, 40 miles where I live right now, 40 miles from a neo-Nazi fort, where there's a tremendous amount of white supremacy and that kind of thing. And this little kid was in the eye of the hurricane because her dad was one of those guys who thought like that. And he got with her mother, and then he had 2 kids. They had 2 kids of their own, and this little girl just got X'd out. And so the material that I put in the book, it's so detailed that it couldn't not be true. There are parts of her life that I could never have imagined had I not seen them. And what I watched for both her and other characters in the book were these incredible survival skills that they came up with. And I knew this from working in alternative school. I knew it, from all over the place that those survival skills don't look real good to a teacher who doesn't know where they're coming from, or to any given caretaker who don't know a person's story. But to me, they became heroic. And as I was writing and telling my stories, I was changing because of the way that I watched people, just piece together broken lives. That my idea of a hero kept changing and changing. because when I was growing up, Superman was a hero, and then I realized he's not really a hero. He's not brave. You can't hurt him. And the people that you can hurt, that just keep getting up and finding a way to kind of piece things together. And that's what Whale Talk was for me. Now, and I really expect this particularly of teenage readers. You could pick up Whale Talk, read a chapter, and say, who cares? Good. Close it, go get a book you like. Because there are a lot of books out there and a lot of writers out there that look at the world in exactly the same way I do. I talk about Laurie Hall Sanderson a lot because I knew her back when she wrote, I'm a bit older than she is, but I knew her back when she wrote Speak. And Laurie Hall Sanderson, I don't care what room you're in right now, Laurie Hall Sanderson could fill it with letters and emails that she's gotten from girls who said, I didn't even know it was rape until I read this book. I thought it was my fault. If you're at a conference, if you're presenting with Laurie Hall Sanderson and you're headed through the crowd going to lunch, you will never get to eat because people stop her and with tears in their eyes just throw their arms around her and hug her because there is this connection, because this character that she created, who is, it's somewhat biographical for Laurie. That character means so much to that kid because it feels so good to know you're not alone if you've been through a situation like that. Now the other dude I have here in this picture is Christopher Paul Curtis, and I know everybody knows Chris from The Watsons Go to Birmingham and a number of books. But I read a book of Christopher Paul Curtis's just fairly recently called The Journey of Little Charlie. And I understand that as a member of the most privileged group of human beings that ever walked the face of the earth, old white guys, that I could never really get it into my gut to know what it felt like to be a slave or to be. Chris tells the story of a young white kid that gets tricked into going after freed slaves up north. And the piece in that story that just changed the way I looked at so much about race, even as much as I've studied it and know it, was he goes up and he finds this young man, and there are all kinds of negotiations and things with the law up there, and are we gonna send these people back because they're in the north now, but you can buy anything. But his parents are there, and they give themselves up. They came on the Underground Railroad and they got away, and they're up around Detroit. And they trade themselves out for their son. And they know they're going to be tortured and probably killed. And they are ecstatic. They are ecstatic because they know that with all that, this one person in their family, after generations and generations, is going to be free. You can't read that kind of detail. You can't read that kind of the kind of intimacy that he puts into that story, and not just be blown away by it. So books like that are out there all over the place. There's another one called How It Went Down. Kekla Magoon wrote How It Went Down. She tells a story of it's a white guy who kills a young black kid who's like a teenager, and the story is told from like 18 different perspectives, and every one of them is detailed in a way that is real, that makes you wonder, wait a minute, was this kid a good kid or a bad kid? Was this shooter a good guy or a bad guy? And she runs it out from witnesses and friends of the guy who did the shooting, and witnesses and friends of the guy the kid who was killed, and their families and all that, and then she walks away and lets you figure it out. And boy, I'll tell you what, you use that book and you will have conversations about race, and boy, is there ever a time to have that conversation than now. And Kekla just leaves you with it. So I was I kind of I work a lot with Bob Probst and Kylene. I do a thing up in Booth Bay Harbor in Maine every year, a teacher's retreat, and they put out so many good books about reading and about the value of reading and writing, and basically you hear Bob say this over and over and over again about how much smarter people get the more they have to be detailed about the things that they write down, and the conversations they have about what they read, and that word choice just makes you smarter and smarter and smarter. And the more exact and the more detailed that you can get in your reading and in your writing, it just makes you, it forces you to look at the world in ways that you might not have. And the greater vocabulary, usable vocabulary that you can come up with, the more you're going to be, in sync with things. And just listening to them, I go there every year and I walk away with more good ideas about reading and more good ideas about writing. Because if you're a writer, the more you know about where your stuff lands, I think the better off you are. One of the things that's in that book, and I kind of feel proud that it's in there because I'm the person who got Bob reading Harari's *Sapiens*. And *Sapiens*, one of the things that Harari says about *Sapiens*, and it's basically the history of humans, and he goes through evolution, and he's a real scientist, is that as human beings we got to where we are because we had fictions, because we were the only species that could tell a story around which larger and larger groups could gather. And the problem with that is basically part of what he's saying is we learn to lie and we gather people around those lies as well. But as I walked away from this book, I thought, okay, we got in this bad place, maybe right up to the brink of disaster, because our fictions put us at the top. And if we tell better truths in our fictions, we might be able to back off from that abyss. So that's the short version of kind of this business of getting ideas out there and having those ideas talked about with other kids, with adults. The whole idea of using story to figure out how we're connected. So let me open it up for any question. I've never been asked a question I wouldn't answer. So I'm a fiction writer, so I might lie. But
several people said, "Oh, Whale Talk is my favorite."
I'm open to anything.
It's used a lot for summer reading programs, so that hit a positive chord for several people here.
It's kind of hit a resurgence lately because of all the talk about white supremacy and things like that. There's been kind of there's a guy working real hard at making a movie, and we talk over back and forth about what the value of certain characters in that, and it's really interesting. Deepest topic I've probably written about, the hardest one I think was probably Chinese handcuffs, when I included one of the main characters as a young woman who had been molested back before all of her life, back before memory. And I was moved to write that story because I was working with a girl who had that experience, and she hadn't told anybody till she was like 16 years old. And we were I'd had her in therapy for about 6 or 7 months, 8 months or something, and we're sitting in there, and she was a voracious reader, and she's one of those kids, perfect student, great athlete, look over here so you don't see what's over here. And she finally said, "You have to write about this because people don't know this." And I said, "Well, I don't know that I can." I said, I get it here, but I don't. And she said, she was funny. She said, I don't think you heard me. You have to write about this. So we had this conversation a little bit, and at some point she said, I'm a really good reader, which would probably make me a good editor. And she read this thing chapter by chapter, and she had a friend also who had been through some of the same stuff. And they edited the book. It took me twice as long to write it. But it was one of those things where you had to have those little details. And you had to have the emotional, you had to get the PTSD piece of it. And not just know that the PTSD thing is there, but actually how it affected them, how it pickaxed them just when they weren't looking. So that was probably the deepest thing I've written. No. I think there's no emotional truth that fiction cannot tell. I think, Walter Dean Myers and I used to talk about what we could write. We would talk about, particularly when you're talking about writing race. Walter Dean Myers left high school when he was 17 years old and went to Vietnam and came back and wrote a whole bunch of good stuff, but he wrote Fallen Angels. There's no way in the world I can write Fallen Angels. So there are a whole bunch of things that I can't tell the truth about, but I don't think there are any truths that can't be written about. They can't be. And I'm talking about a truth that a reader looks at, reads, and recognizes and feels connected.
Andrea right now said, Tim O'Brien said, story truth is truer than truth. Good line. Good line. Amazing. Yeah. So those of you that posed questions that didn't get responded to because
Tim O'Brien's book, the things they carried is a Bible to me.
On the front slide, and it's also on the last slide. So I'm sure he would be glad to respond to some of those questions. So feel free to go ahead and send those to him because we do want to honor the time. This is a list of resources that NCTE, National Council of Teachers of English, has, including information about their Intellectual Freedom Center and so on. Many of you as students, as university students, as potential teachers, college professors, the NCTE resources are extremely important. So if you're not familiar with them, please do take advantage of those resources. And all of the books that were mentioned in the slides are listed here, including all of Chris's work. And so if you're looking for those for your own resources, those are there as well. So Chris, thank you so much. It's been a delight. You just bring so much to us every time you talk. I've had that advantage of hearing you multiple times over the course of many years, and I can't thank you enough for everything you've done tonight. And we'll close with a charming picture of you and your brother, and I'm sure that brings back many, many memories.
Oh yeah, and the one thing I want to say about my email, I welcome questions and I welcome dialogue between with people out there to talk about reading and writing and any of those kind of things. So
have a wonderful evening.
Don't hesitate if you feel like you have something you want to ask.
See you at the next webinar coming up in April. Take care. Good night.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.